All right, so comrades, there were class structures before. There were a ruling class before. There wasn't a working class. It was something called a peasantry. You can look in Africa, you can look in Europe, you can look everywhere, you can look Asia. Now, under this system, it's called feudalism. It existed in Africa. So you had chiefs, which were the ruling class. You had kings that were the ruling class. You had lords that owned the land that were the ruling class. But what people produced under that was, you actually had, if you go right back to human history, there were no classes. So way back. Like 200,000 years ago, there were modern humans. But there was no class. Class only comes about like 10,000 years ago when you have actual people claiming land. And those are the landlords. Those are actually, in a weird way, even though it's community owned, are chiefs. And the way they live actually was, the bulk of people were peasants. But you didn't produce to make money. You produced to survive. So you as a peasant, you might have your cattle, you might have, I don't know, your wheat, you might have millies, whatever you were producing. And you were producing to survive. You had people that were tradespeople. They would produce shoes, but they weren't producing to make money. They were producing the shoes to barter with a farmer to get food, because they couldn't produce their own food. But now the lords didn't actually work the land. The chiefs don't actually work the land. They take tribute. So you as a peasant have a right to live on a lord's land. And the lords claim the land, or the king, or even if you want a chief, they claim the land by theft, violence. They said, we own this. We don't give a crap, you're going to work for us. You can have a piece of land and you'll work for us. So the first class society came with violence. It's the only way a ruling class came about, because why would you give up your land if you didn't have to? And go live on a lord's land. Then you as a peasant would work the lord's land. It's considered yours in theory. But the lord decides and he parcels out the land, or the chief parcels out the land. Then you work it. You keep some of your produce, but you give the rest to a lord or a chief. A small bit. So even if you got cattle, as tribute, you might say, okay, thank you for the land, or allow me to work here, I'll give you one of my 10 cows. Or I'll give you some of my wheat. And that's how they built up wealth. But they weren't producing to make money. But there's a change that happens in about 1600, and it's got to do with trade. You had landlords. There were big trade centers on the east coast of Africa and China, like for thousands of years, 2,000, 3,000 years. And they would barter goods that were produced in these feudal systems. And there was a place on the edge of Europe called Genoa. It's in Italy, and they used to draw Genoa and Venice. They used to trade with these trade routes. But they wouldn't allow other European countries and the lords and kings that controlled them to have access to that trade. They said, you can't have access, you have to go through us. And the Portuguese first wanted to break this. They went around the east coast of Africa to these trading cities, because they didn't want to go through Venice, because the lords and kings weren't making money. It's not capitalism, it's still like feudalism, but it's based still on trade. And what they did, they went and tried to trade, and the traders said, well, your goods are shit. Sorry, I'm using bad language, but they said that. So what the Portuguese did is they went and they bombed all the cities and they took them over, and they controlled the trade. Later on, the British actually take it over. But now the British start thinking, and in Britain it was lords and a king who were the ruling class. They had peasants that worked for them, who gave them tribute. So what they decided, well, why are we not producing the goods that we get? Because they actually wanted to start doing something. They started to change. They weren't interested in tribute anymore. They wanted to make money. And they were selling commodities eventually to make money. So they were taking the peasants' stuff and then they were trading it with Asia, India. But they wanted to make money. But they had a problem, because they thought, okay, well, why are we now trading India? Why do we go and give all our money to like India and the peasants in India, and also our lords actually who control the trade in India? Why do we do that? So they thought, no, well, what we actually should do is we should start producing factories. We should make it here. But they didn't have a labor force.
Sure, why don't you give an example?
Yeah.
To do with the factories and maybe say that.
Okay, so they didn't have anyone to work in the factories. They had peasants who, in theory, were staying on the land. So they didn't have people to go work in the factories. They were peasants on the land, but they would take tribute.
Now, what kind of factories are you talking about?
Cotton factories. So they didn't want to import clothes from India anymore. They wanted to make it in Britain, because they knew they could make more money making them themselves than bartering. So they took and they decided, and they violently kicked people off the land. They told the peasants, we own the land, goodbye. And the state passed laws, said, you can't live on a lord's land anymore, you must go. And now you don't even have access to a piece of land to produce anymore, so what do? You sell yourself to try and live. And then these lords who had actually got rich out of feudalism opened factories and then started to hire the people they were actually throwing off the land. And they said, fine, we'll pay you a wage. And you work for us, but you own nothing. Your wage, in theory, covers your survival. So you can actually eat, so you can come back tomorrow to work. That's what you get paid a wage for. So these people who used to produce land, like in Africa, they had access to land. They might not have owned it, but they had access, were kicked off the land. And it repeats itself in South Africa in terms of people violently being thrown off the land. We'll get back to that later when you look at the readings. So they wanted workers. They didn't want peasants and tribute anymore. That was like small fry. They kicked people off the land and they started paying them a wage. So central to actually capitalism is to make profits. It's to make money. So under feudalism, you produced to make goods, so you could trade, so you could survive, etc. Capitalism, the dominant thing becomes you get money through feudalism originally, but you want to make more money. You just sell goods. Doesn't matter what you sell. Capitalists aren't interested in really providing shoes for us, but they think they can make money out of providing shoes. So the original cotton factories, they weren't interested in clothing anyone. They wanted to make money out of selling the cotton. And that's what they were doing. But now, so that's the basis of capitalism, but it's a violent system. It was imposed by violence even in Britain. They created a working class. So they kicked you off the means of production, so you couldn't farm yourself. They said go, and then you had to work for someone else. And how they actually keep on getting rich is, one, they already claimed the land, but then the law says they own the factories. So if you even as a worker go try and grab one of the factories, you can't. Am I, your comrades with me, or am I losing you?
Yeah.
So what they do is then you go off and work with the working class. Now what they're interested in is a capitalist. Your boss is making money. So he will pay you a wage. So I don't know, he pays you like, let's say 10 Rand a day. We can use the example to make shoes. So he'll pay you one worker 10 Rand a day. But in return, what you maybe produce in a day is like 10 shoes. And he will sell the shoes for 20 Rand each. He will make 200 Rand, but he pays you 10 Rand.
Yeah.
He keeps the rest himself. He might have to pay rent, he might have to pay electricity, but that's how he extracts wealth from the working class. So we produce everything, but we only get a wage in return. You get like a fraction in return, and the rest is kept by the capitalists because they own the factories, they own the mines, which are originally stolen anyway, and it's backed in law. So that's how the wage system works. You work like hours and hours, but you get a fraction back. And then the capitalist sells the shoes for 200 Rand each. But he might hire 100 workers. So he will then, his wage bill might be 1,000 Rand a day, but he'll be making, what's that? 20,000 Rand out of selling shoes a day because he's got 100 workers. But they're also not interested in hiring workers. So we are sometimes told capitalists hire workers. So a capitalist, if he can actually, instead of hiring 100 people, hire 80 people, he will do that. So he will reduce to 80. It means they work harder, but they still produce the 200 shoes. And what he does is he gets the same profit, but his wage bill drops. So now he doesn't have to pay 1,000 Rand a day. He pays 800 Rand a day to all his workers. So capitalism also creates unemployment because they actually want as few people working for them as possible. If I can hire you in a factory, there's 5 of you, but I can make 4 of you do the job, I'll get rid of 1 of you. Because it brings down my cost. So it's a system that creates unemployment, it creates poverty, but the way they do it is they do it, 1, they own the means of production, and 2, they pay a wage. It's a wage-based system. You sell your labor. Remember we said earlier on, you sell your labor.
Yeah.
That's the way you have to survive, but the capitalists use that to actually exploit you. They say, well, you want to come work here, we'll pay you 10 Rand a day, not 20. Don't come and ask for 20.